Hello everyone, and welcome back to day 13 of the Advent of Cyber 3 by TryHackMe's. Today's challenge is all about privilege escalation in a Windows environment. Now, if you're new to pen testing, this won't mean much to you, but if you have a little bit of experience, you may be biased thinking that Windows is harder or more boring than Linux, and I would tend to agree with you. I don't really like window environment for Privesc. However, you need to know it, right? You need to do some Windows machines. You can't just go around and doing only Linux. You need to know your Windows. So let's dive straight into it. I won't go too deep into the theory just because there's a lot of theory that you could have on Windows, and my video won't be enough to teach you theory about Windows privilege escalation. It's just a whole field on its own. Well, not a whole field, but there's courses dedicated to Windows privilege escalation. So what can I do? Well, I'll go over real quick these different privilege escalation vectors, and then I'll just dive straight into the practical part of this video. So let's look at stored credentials. Well, of course, stored credentials in a Windows environment, for example, are the same as on a Linux environment. You just find passwords. You can go am, right? Kernel exploit, if you have a bad version of the Windows operating system, for example, some of them could be vulnerable to kernel exploits. So that's basically a program that you will run that will exploit a vulnerability inside the Windows version itself. That's not rare to see that in the wild, I don't think, but I don't think it's the most common one either. Insecure file and folder permissions. For example, if you can read or write over files and folders that contain sensitive information, you could, kind of like in the Linux, if you can read the etc shadow file and you can find password hashes, for example, well, it's kind of the same concept here. Or example, if you have access to the SSH keys of someone, etc. It's kind of the same concept here. Service permissions, it's similar to sensitive files, and we'll actually do this today, I believe. It's about insecure service permissions. So basically, we're going to use a service to privilege escalate today. DLL hijacking. So some applications use DLL files which are basically extra files that are being used during a application execution. And basically, if you can hijack them, well, like create a fake, well, or malicious DLL file, then the execution of the program could actually give you privileges. Unquoted service path. That's very interesting because in the Windows file system, for example, if you do, if there's a space, Windows will try to look for extensions, right? So if a service contains a space and is not enclosed with quotes, a hacker could introduce their malicious executable to run instead of their intended executable. So for example, if the intended executable should execute inside the program files, which has a space, right? And you can write into the program files folder, well, you could create a program.exe. I'll show it on screen right now, but you can create a program.exe malicious file that will run before the intended program, because the way Windows think is, okay, so there's a space, so let's look if there's a exe of the first word first, and if there is, I will execute that first, unless there are quotes, right? So that's why it's called unquoted service path. Always install elevated. So some Windows application can be installed using Windows installer, and these files make the installation process easy and straightforward, blah, blah, blah. So if there's always install elevated, you can install basically anything with admin privileges and without requiring the user to have these privileges, right? It's such a overview, like high level overview. You will need to get your information elsewhere, like not in this video, sadly. I don't have time to go over everything in detail, but there are courses dedicated to that, and if you want, I could actually make a video going more in depth, so let me know in the comments below if you would like that. So let's go straight into the practical part and not waste any more time just talking about theory. So let's go into it. So what we need to do is actually RDP into the machine. Now, if you watched my previous videos, you know that my favorite way of RDPing is using Remina because it's very easy to do. So what I do is I go into Remina, I will create a new connection. You should already know that if you watch all of my videos. If you didn't, welcome, and hope you stick along. So let's do, for example, day 13 as the name. And then the server, we need to provide the IP address. Username will be mcskitty and password will be password1. Next, we can do save and connect, and that should RDP us into the machine. Accept the certificate. And what we can do once we are inside the machine is actually click the little toggle dynamic resolution. And that way, when you go full screen, it's actually going to follow along and go full screen as well. All right, so let's do the first question. So complete the username P. So how do we find users on a Windows machine? Well, we need to open a little command shell, which you can do by clicking the window icon and then do cmd for the command prompt. And then we can do net users. Now doing net users will actually show us that the username we're looking for is Pepper. So let's copy this by pressing Ctrl C and not Ctrl Shift C because it's a Windows environment. Don't forget that. And then we can paste it. So what is the OS version? So I know there's a command here that just show it to us. However, there's a slight mistake that I will fix. So if we were to enter this, it won't work, right? It won't just show us the OS name and OS version because there's a space here. So what we need to do is to fix it is just simply remove the space. So that's a slight mistake, and actually add a space here as well. So that's the right command, right? Now if we do this, we'll actually only find OS name and OS version. So we see our OS version, which is this one. So Control C to copy it, and then we can paste it. See, that's doing quite easy, right? So what backup service did you find running on the system? So inside this here, it does mention Privesc backups. I just need to find it again. All right, so exploitation. So the Privesc backup service suffers from privilege escalation vulnerability. That's what we will exploit. So we know that we're looking for something called Privesc. It's a bit cheating, but the reverse, like if we were just doing it manually, would take us so long. And I think if we look at the ink, and we actually do have the service name itself that we could just copy paste, but we'll find it, right? So what we can do is do WMIC service list. But if we do that, it's going to be a very ugly output, as you'll see soon. Yeah, so see, that's very ugly output. So what we can do is instead of this command, we can do brief, or we can do full. Now brief will actually give us the Privesc service name. If we scroll up a bit to Privesc, so here we found Privesc SVC. However, for the next question, we need to have the path. So what we can do is we can do a similar command. So we can do, but instead of brief, we will use, where is my CLS? Okay, there we go. So let's do WMIC, sorry, service list. And let's do full instead. And it's actually going to be a nicer display. However, there's a lot of services we don't need, but we can Control F, right? Because this is Windows. So we can do Privesc. And we found it right here. So if we look at the name, we see that this is the Privesc SVC, which is the question that we previously answered. And the full path is actually this thing. There we go. So run the UMI command on the connection you have received on your attacking machine. So, all right, so now they're telling us that we need to exploit the machine, right? So we need to follow these steps, right? So it's not clear that they didn't want us to do that, but basically right now we are Mexicity. So if I do UMI, we see that we are MexCity, right? But we need to Privesc, right? This is the old goal of the room. So now we're going to do the little magic of Christmas and basically privilege escalate from MexCity, which is a regular user, to the Grinch, which is an administrator user. And we can actually see the Grinch exists. Oops, net users. The Grinch exists right here. I'm not sure if he's an administrator user, but basically we need to Privesc to the Grinch. So what we need to do now is very cool. So let's not do this in the right order, and let's start off by creating our script that will be run when we execute. So I will go step by step. You can read it here like in full details, but still I'll try to explain the step by step of what we're doing because this is so cool. So let's create a script here, right? So let's do a text document and call it evil, for example, or let's call it Privesc, right? Let's do Privesc, and we'll need to change not the format, but we need to change the file type of this document. All right, so NC, if you don't know about NC, this is NCAT, and NCAT is basically a way to connect to the, I won't try to explain it, I'll just put it on screen right now, the real definition. I don't want to mislead you, but basically NCAT will allow you to connect to ports and IP addresses. And basically what we're doing here is we're running NCAT, and we're gonna go connect to our own IP address and on the port of our choosing, and we're gonna execute command.exe. So we're gonna execute this little shell prompt that, well, command prompt. So we're gonna have execution as whoever user runs this, right? I'll show you what I mean by that. So let's go here and let's get our IP address. So we need to be on the VPN. You probably knew that already, but basically if we go into our if config, or we can also do IPA, look at the ton0, right? Ton0 is for tunnel, and that's your VPN IP address. You need to have your INET, this first part right here. So grab this and switch it for this thing, right? Instead of the attack IP. And I'll also switch my port to 443, right? Just so to show you that we can switch the ports, right? So let's save this, right? This is what it should look like. So replace this IP address with your own IP address, right? Your tunnel0 IP address and your port of your choosing. Then leave the rest like this. Then we can go into our documents and we'll need to rename it. But before we can rename it, we actually need to view its extension. So going to view file name extensions, take that, and then we can actually rename it by pressing F2 and then rename this to PAT, which is a script in Windows. So now let's go to our Kali machine and let's open nc-nvlp and then provide 443. So basically we're listening with verbose on the port 443, right? So we are open for a connection to come to us, which is what will happen here, right? In our script, if we go back and, well, look at this, right? So what this is doing is netcat will attempt to connect to our IP address and port. So that port needs to be open, which is what we just did here. And then it's gonna push the command.exe thing. So what do you think it's gonna do? Well, if I were to run this script, I would have a command prompt as MexKitty, right? Because right now we are MexKitty, and MexKitty will connect to us and do the command.exe executable, right? And as you can see, if we are right here, and if I do UMI, we are MexKitty, right? So this isn't privilege escalation, right? We just basically opened the shell. So for the privilege escalation, we need to have this program be ran by somebody with higher privileges than us, or by basically somebody else, right? So, and this, if we have somebody else, let's say administrator, run this program, then our little prompt here will be a administrator instead of MexKitty. So let's clear our terminal and open the port again. And next time we're gonna get a connection, we're gonna be the Grinch. So let's close this, we don't need that. And what we need to do now is actually create a Perius task, right? So let's go Perius backup, and I will follow along these things here. So we already did this part because I wanted to explain to you how NC works, well, netcat works. So now let's follow step by step. So now, first we need to create a backup task, and we can set the backup path to whatever we want. So let's go here and let's create a new backup job. Now the items we need to backup is whatever we want, but in our example, they tell us to use documents. So I'll use documents. So let's go make cd, click the little arrow, and then select documents, then OK, and then OK. So our backup path is done. Next, we need the destination. For the destination, they tell us to use desktop. So let's go and use desktop. Select, make cd, and finally desktop. Press OK and press OK again. So now we have our what we need to back up going into our desktop. That's all good. But the other processes tab is what matters, because basically we can run a program after or before every backup process. And now keep in mind, we just created a small script that is basically the equivalent of a program in this terms being used here. So what we need to do basically is when we run the backup, we can run it as a service. And if we run it as a service, we will actually be able to run it as another user, in this case, the Grinch. So you understand how we're doing this, right? So we are setting up so we're basically telling the backup tool to run a script before we run the backup process. And then what we tell it is, okay, so now run the script before you run the backup process, but I want the backup process to be run as a service which is being run by another user. So that other user is going to run the script for us. Does that make sense? So let's go ahead and basically set it up. So we need to set up our script to run. So let's go into other processes, and before backup, we want to run a program or external file. And what we want is actually to run privesc.bat. So let's select this. And then we can actually press next and OK. So now this is our backup job. And next, what we can do is right click it and run backup as a service. And you can see that this is going to be run as the Grinch hack, which is the host name, but the user is the Grinch. So if we click here, we see that the backup will run automatically in 1 minute. So let's make sure we have our listener open. And just like that, we see that the backup started, so the script ran, and we got a prompt back, right? Because we asked the backup to run our privesc.bat script before it backups. So now if we do who am I, we see that we are not MakeCD, we are the Grinch. So let's grab this and answer the next question. All right, so now what is the content of the flag.txt file? Well, if we go into cd c/users, we see that there's the Grinch folder. So let's go here. Then we can do there and see that there's the same folders as expected. And now we can start looking at where that flag is. So we can do their desktop, for example, and see that there's nothing of interest here. And then we can do their documents and see that we have a flag here. So let's cd to documents. And then we can there again to see it. And then we can do type flag.txt. And we got a flag. So we can now input it. And the Grinch forgot to delete a file where he keeps note about the schedule. Where can we find it at 5:30 a.m.? Well, there's a schedule.txt file here. So we can just do type schedule.txt. And at 5:30, it's going to be in jazzercise. So just like that, guys, we have not fully compromised, but we have compromised the Grinch account, and we have learned a little bit about privilege escalation. And hopefully you learned something. That's a very deep subject, so I invite you to look more into it if you're interested. If you would like me to make a video about it, make sure to comment, and I will see if I can make something interesting for you guys. Let's go to the outro. Thank you guys so much for watching this 13th episode of the Advent of Cyber 3 by TryHackMe. So this challenge was a bit harder just because it's using privilege escalation, which is a concept so important in CTFs, hacking in general, and it's so deep. And the fact that TryHackMe managed to give us a 20-minute challenge, more or less, about it is quite impressive. But if you want to learn more, there are more methods around on the web, and there are more courses that you can look as well. If you would be interested in me making a video about it, make sure to comment it below and I'll see what I can do with it. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you want to support me, the links are in the description below. Take care and see you tomorrow for day 14 of the Advent of Cyber 3 by TryHackMe.